In our headlines on this Thursday afternoon, March 23rd. The US Federal Reserve raises its rates by 25 basis points despite the recent failures of regional lenders, and finance authorities here say the baby step eases pressure, but risk factors remain. Meanwhile, President Yoon Suk-yeol and US President Joe Biden are scheduled to co-host the second Summit for Democracy come March 29th to the 30th, along with their counterparts from 3 other continents. And South Korea marks yet another decrease in population last year as the country's fertility rate plunges to 0.78, fewer than half the average rate among 38 OECD countries that stands at 1.59. US Fed authorities are placing their priority on tackling inflation, despite fears that their policy may further aggravate the country's financial concerns. Accordingly, interest rates have been raised by 25 basis points. Our finance correspondent Arirang reports.
The U.S. Federal Reserve takes another baby step. The central bank on Wednesday raised its short-term borrowing rate by 0.25 percentage points as they continue efforts to bring down inflation. This comes despite concerns that previous rate increases helped trigger the nation's banking crisis. The rate hike brings the Fed's policy rate to the 4.75% to 5% range, the highest since October 2007. The Fed pointed to modest growth in spending and production as one of the reasons for imposing another hike. It also added that an unemployment rate has remained low amid job gains in recent months, while inflation remains elevated. The Fed also rejected concerns about the financial system, saying that the U.S. banking system is sound and resilient.
We will continue to closely monitor conditions in the banking system and are prepared to use all of our tools as needed to keep it safe and sound. In addition, we are committed to learning the lessons from this episode and to work to prevent events like this from happening again.
As banks rely on a central source of capital, the rapid rise in interest rates tanked the value of bonds held by Silicon Valley Bank, causing the bank's failure. Because of this, there have been speculation from some experts that the central bank might not impose another rate hike following global concerns about bank stability. The Fed has been pushing on with its aggressive campaign to tame inflation, raising the rate by 75 basis points 4 times in a row last year. Although hikes had slowed down last December and February, analysts prior to the SVB crisis had suggested the need for another giant step as inflation once again crept up and a boost in employment figures. But once SVB collapsed, experts say this 25 basis points increase is a middle ground decision for the Fed. The central bank meanwhile left the door open for further rate increases, noting that additional policy firming may be appropriate to lower inflation to the Fed's 2% target. Policymakers expect rates to tick higher this year, with the benchmark rate peaking at 5.1% by the end of 2023. Lee-hyun, Arirang News.
Here in South Korea, there has been a small sigh of relief amid the Fed's latest baby step in tackling inflation, but finance authorities continue to monitor both external and internal developments as broader concerns remain. Our Lee Soo-jin explains.
The Fed's most recent decision on rates has somewhat mitigated worries for the Bank of Korea. That's according to Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho during Thursday's emergency economic meeting attended by other financial officials, including the governor of the Bank of Korea, Lee Chang-yong. The Bank of Korea can rest somewhat more easily with the news that the U.S. Central Bank has pushed its benchmark interest rate up by 0.25 percentage points. On the back of the FOMC decision, the BOK may once again keep the key interest rate at the current level of 3.5% as it continues to monitor economic conditions. Adding to this view is the Consumer Price Index growth falling to the 4% range in February for the first time in 10 months. The Fed, however, may continue to push rates higher if needed. The Fed's rate hike of 25 basis points brought the benchmark rate to the 4.75% to 5% range, leaving some concerns about the 1.25 to 1.50 percentage points gap in key interest rates between South Korea and the U.S. The 1.50 percentage points gap is the highest since October 2000. And that gap will widen to 1.75 percentage points if the Fed decides to hike interest rates by only 25 basis points in May, and the BOK decides to once again keep interest rates unchanged at its next policy meeting in April. There are also still concerns regarding the global economy, even though the domestic financial market remains stable as a whole.
As we cannot completely rule out the possibilities of instability in the global financial market and a greater uncertainty in the real economy during the process of adjusting to a tight monetary policy environment, we will continue to closely and carefully monitor the current situation.
The BOK may also have no choice but to consider raising rates if the Korean won falls below the psychological threshold of 1,300 won against the US dollar once again, which pushes up the prices of important goods. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the ripple effects of the failure of Silicon Valley Bank have been evident here in Korea, given the drop in domestic stock funds. According to Korea Exchange, as of this past Monday, the total value of stock funds stand at some $101.8 billion US. Now, this amount is down 1.8% from March 10th, when the US regional lenders' collapse was reported. Since then, foreign investors dumped over $1 billion worth of stocks in the country's benchmark Kospi and tech-heavy Kosdaq. In response, Seoul's Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho on this Thursday pledged close monitoring and prompt action should the need arise. Come next week, President Yoon Suk-yeol will be co-hosting the second virtual summit for democracy, which was launched by his U.S. counterpart Joe Biden back in 2021 to address corruption and advance human rights. President Yoon, for his part, will be promoting common prosperity. Our senior top office correspondent Oh Soo-young has more.
President Yoon Suk-yeol will host a summit for democracy next week, with South Korea representing the Indo-Pacific region. Seoul's top office said Thursday that the South Korean president will join the leaders of the United States, Costa Rica, Zambia and the Netherlands in kicking off the two-day virtual event with joint opening remarks. The Summit for Democracy was launched in 2021 by US President Joe Biden to address the growing challenges to civil and political rights and human rights across the world amid the rise of autocratic governments. With the second summit beginning next Wednesday, President Yoon will host the first leader-level plenary session on democracy delivering economic growth and shared prosperity. The live session will be held online and involve leading activists and figures in civil society. On Thursday, Seoul will hold an offline regional meeting representing the Indo-Pacific, focusing on challenges and progress in addressing corruption. The offline event will be attended by ministerial-level participants, with Washington's Trade Representative Ambassador Catherine Tay leading the US delegation to South Korea. Featuring remarks by leaders and ministers from the Indo-Pacific region, the event will highlight the importance of the institutions and values of democracy, ethical values and justice, based on South Korea's own experience.
As it overcame war and poverty with the help of the international community and grew into an advanced democratic power, this is a meaningful way South Korea can give back by sharing its accumulated know-how.
The National Security Advisor also said this summit will serve as a way for South Korea to demonstrate its global leadership by contributing to the promotion of democracy, ultimately serving as a stage for Seoul's multilateral diplomacy based on freedom and solidarity. Some 110 countries are expected to attend the virtual summit on democracy, along with members of international organizations, the private sector and civil society. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
And for the first time in 5 years, South Korea joins the UN Human Rights Council as a co-sponsor for its upcoming resolution on North Korea's human rights abuses. According to Yonhap News Agency, citing diplomatic sources, Seoul is among the list of governments that took part in discussions to frame out a preliminary resolution led by the EU. Similar resolutions have been adopted for the past 20 years in a row, but South Korea has refrained from co-sponsoring them for 4 straight years since 2019, amid the former administration's efforts to engage North Korea. Among the new concerns in this year's preliminary resolution are the regime's ban on foreign cultural contents and its inhumane treatment of foreign detainees. A final resolution will be submitted during a session slated for later this month. Meanwhile, back on Wednesday, North Korea engaged in a fresh round of cruise missile launches. My colleague Kim Mo-gyeon has details.
South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff says that North Korea begun firing several cruise missiles from its Hamhung area at around 10:15 a.m. on Wednesday. Authorities are analyzing further details, while sources say there were likely long-range strategic cruise missiles, also known as the North's version of Washington's Tomahawk. Wednesday's launch comes amid Seoul and Washington's combined Freedom Shield exercise, as well as the concurrent field training exercise called the Warrior Shield. The launches are seen as an act of protest by the North. Following the launch, Seoul's military said through a press release that it will successfully wrap up the Freedom Shield and continue to carry out the Warrior Shield in a high-intensity manner. It also added that the military has been on close watch of the regime and its movements, though they cannot reveal all the details. The latest launch also comes just 3 days after North Korea fired a short-range ballistic missile into the East Sea during what it claimed to be tactical nuclear counterattack drills. Pundits are now on the watch for further provocative actions from Pyongyang as the joint 11-day Freedom Shield exercise is set to end on Thursday. Kim Mo-gyeon, Arirang News.
At the National Assembly, an opposition-led motion urging the government to purchase surplus rice to stabilize prices is being put to a vote on this Thursday afternoon. The Democratic Party is betting on its majority at the Parliament to push through the revision to the Grain Management Act. The ruling People Power Party, for its part, is opposing the measure, insisting that it will burden national coffers and fuel overproduction. In fact, ruling lawmakers are looking into the possibility of President Yoon Suk-yeol vetoing the bill if passed. The Assembly will also create a committee of lawmakers who, starting next week, will address electoral reforms ahead of the 2024 general elections. Meanwhile, also on this Thursday, the motion seeking parliamentary consent for the arrest of ruling party lawmaker Ha Young-jae on charges of corruption will be reported to the National Assembly and put to a vote next week. In other news, Korea's population shrank yet again in 2022 amid the country's dismal fertility rate. Our Moon Hye-ryun has more on the national demographic trend.
For 2 consecutive years, the country's population has been falling. This is according to the annual report on Korean society released by Statistics Korea on Thursday, which showed that the total population fell by 117,000 last year, going from around 51,745,000 in 2021 to around 51,628,000 in 2022. The country's low fertility rate is the biggest contributor to this decline. In 2022, the fertility rate in Korea, the average number of children a woman is expected to have in her lifetime, dipped below 0.8 for the first time since data was first compiled in 1970. Standing at 0.78, it's less than half the average birth rate across the 38 OECD countries, which is 1.59. Statistics Korea attributed this to the decline in the number of new marriages throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it wasn't just the pandemic that put marriages on hold. According to a survey conducted by Statistics Korea, fewer and fewer people are feeling like they need to get married. In 2010, nearly 65% of the population aged 13 and over felt that marriage was a necessity, but in 2022, this had fallen to 50%. The social trend of fewer people wanting to get married and have children was reflected in the average number of people per household. The size of households in 2021 fell to an average of 2.3 people per household, and the percentage of households with 3 or more people also fell. In 2010, more than half the country's households were made up of 3 or more people. In 2021, this accounted for just 38% of households. Meanwhile, more people are feeling happier with their current lifestyle and fewer people are feeling lonely. At the start of the COVID-19 outbreak in 2020, only 61.6% of citizens responded that they were satisfied with their current lifestyle. Last year, this rose to 75.4%. Similarly, while the percentage of people feeling lonely in 2020 hit 22.3%, this fell to 19.2% in 2022. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
On the weather front, a heavy blanket of yellow dust is in the forecast for Korea starting later this afternoon until tomorrow, that would be Friday. Health authorities are calling on commuters to wear face masks and on the vulnerable to refrain from venturing outdoors. Our Lee Seung-jae reports.
A cloud of dust covers the Chinese capital city of Beijing. Drivers turned on their headlights even during the day, and people are wearing their face masks throughout the city. On Wednesday, the air quality in Beijing reached hazardous levels, with the main pollutant being fine dust. And it didn't help that China is also experiencing the worst yellow dust of the year, originating from the Gobi Desert. Starting Thursday, that yellow dust is headed to South Korea. With northwest winds carrying the yellow dust, Incheon and Gyeonggi-do province are under a yellow dust advisory. The Ministry of the Environment on Wednesday issued an advisory at attention, the lowest of 4 levels. High levels of yellow dust are expected to hit Seoul, North Chungcheong-do province, and Jeollabuk-do province by Thursday afternoon, with Jeollanam-do and Gangwon-do provinces expected to be hit with the yellow dust by evening. Prime Minister Han Duck-soo called on relevant ministries to make sure measures are put in place to protect people in the country. He also called on the people to check that windows are closed properly and refrain from any outdoor activities. Elderly citizens are especially asked to stay indoors. Experts say with factories in China in full operation after the lifting of its zero-COVID policy, high concentrations of heavy metal could be brought in along with the yellow dust. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
And over in France, public protests persist as President Emmanuel Macron pledges to push through its plans to raise the country's retirement age from 62 to 64. Our Kim Do-yeon has the latest.
In Paris, some streets are in flames as protesters on Wednesday ramp up their show of discontent over pension reforms. This is a response to French President Emmanuel Macron saying that he's adamant about raising the country's retirement age from 62 to 64 by the year 2030, despite the public anger.
As I speak to you right now, do you think I enjoyed doing this reform? No. Do you think I could have done the same as many others before me and swept the dust under the rug? Yes, maybe. But the reality is today there's one thing I regret. It's that we weren't able to inform of the constraints and more specifically the need to undergo this reform.
While the protests were largely peaceful when President Macron first proposed the plan, but following his decision to push the bill through without a parliamentary vote last week and subsequently surviving 2 no-confidence votes, the situation in parts of the country has gone downhill. And Macron on Wednesday faced the cameras for the first time since then, where he said he understood the public's anger but condemned violent protests. But above all, he made it clear that the system has to be changed.
When I entered into my working life, there were 10 million retirees. Now there are 17 million. In the 2030s, there will be 20 million. Do you think that we can continue with the same laws?
The bill is now in the hands of the French Constitutional Council or the country's constitutional court. The judges will be looking into the law over the coming weeks, and it can only be passed with their approval. Macron says the bill needs to be enacted before the end of the year. In the meantime, French unions have announced more protests and call for people to join in. High-speed and regional trains, the Paris Metro, and other public transportation in major cities were expected to be disrupted. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In Afghanistan and Pakistan, an earthquake has killed over 8,000 people. At least 19 people have been killed and over 200 have been injured after a 6.5 magnitude earthquake struck the northern regions of Afghanistan and Pakistan on Tuesday, local time. At least 10 of those who died were in Afghanistan, and the total death toll is expected to rise as rescue teams in both countries work to find survivors. The quake triggered landslides and caused some buildings to collapse. Some tremors were even felt in India, as well as in the Afghan capital, Kabul, and Pakistani capital, Islamabad. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, the earthquake was recorded at 187 kilometers deep, and its center was 40 kilometers southeast of the Afghan town of Jurm. The quake came at a time when many families were outside their homes celebrating Nowruz, the Persian New Year. Moving on to Scotland now, where 35 people have been injured after a ship tipped over. Strong winds dislodged the ship from its holdings at Edinburgh's Imperial Dock on Wednesday morning local time. Among those injured, 23 were sent to hospital, with some in serious condition. 12 others were treated at the scene. Pictures show the 3,000-ton U.S. Navy research vessel Petrel leaning at a 45-degree angle in the dry dock. The U.S. consulate in Edinburgh has said it is offering support to U.S. citizens involved and that it's monitoring the situation. It also thanked local emergency services for their quick response. Meanwhile, a museum in the Austrian capital of Vienna is drawing awareness to climate change by hanging its paintings askew. The Leopold Museum has opened a new exhibit titled A Few Degrees More, where 15 paintings by the likes of Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele have been tilted by a few degrees. The number of degrees tilted reflects the number of temperature degree changes expected at locations depicted in each of the paintings. The exhibit comes just a few months after the same museum was targeted by members of the climate activist group Last Generation. Activists threw black oily liquid on a Klimt painting protected by glass, with one even gluing themselves to the glass. And finally, the world's oldest near-complete Bible has gone on display in a museum in Israel. Viewable in the Museum of the Jewish People, the leather-bound, handwritten manuscript is believed to have been made around the year 900. It contains almost all of the Hebrew Bible and is called the Codex Sassoon, after its previous owner, David Solomon Sassoon. The display of the Bible comes before it's set to be auctioned by Sotheby's in New York in May. There, it's expected to go under the hammer for an estimated $30 to $50 million US. If it sells close to its estimated value, it could become the most valuable historical document ever sold. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. Right after the rain goes away, it's yellow dust that's now covering most of the western regions, pushing air quality to very bad levels again in Korea's western port city, Incheon, all day, while the capital in Chungcheong-namdo province will see severe levels from this afternoon. The south coast has been seeing heavier rainfall. Coastlines along the Gyeongsang-do provinces will see up to 40 millimeters of rain. In southern parts of the country, we'll see 5 to 20 millimeters until late this afternoon. Seoul saw the record-breaking March warmth yesterday at 25.1 degrees, while temperatures stay on the warmer side today in the capital before returning to near norms tomorrow. And it is so unfortunate that those of us in the western parts of the country could not fully enjoy the warmth for the last couple of days due to that very bad dust levels. But air quality should improve a bit tomorrow with cold northwesterly winds. Then typical early spring weather is in the forecast with wide gaps in temperatures. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That ends Thursday's afternoon newscast, but do stay with us for our panel session coming up right after this break. See you soon.